Hey, what's up guys? My name's Thomas. I'm the author of the file. And first off, I'd like to say thank you very much for purchasing Double Exposure Kit. I'm really excited to go over with you how to use this project and kind of get you up and running because it is a really simple project, but it's also kind of deep. There's a lot of little nooks and crannies and things to edit that I want to show you how you can get in and out as quick as possible and get awesome results. So first, let's go over what we have in the project panel. You'll see that we have the main module. So this is the final result that you're going to see in this comp. And then below that, we have the different steps. Now, in here, I tried to make this as easy as possible to understand exactly what to do, when to do it, and in what order to do it. So we have step 1, insert your sources. So if we twirl that down, you'll see that we have our primary source, our secondary source, and our custom background. All right, so moving on, we have step 1, insert the sources. Step 2, isolate the elements. And in that step, we're going to be isolating the primary source. And then as an option, isolating the secondary source as well. And we're going to go into much more detail on that later, but just know for right now that that's what we're going to be doing for step 2. So step 3, we're going to be bringing it all together by editing the double exposure and editing the layout and color correcting everything. And then in step 4, we're going to be editing the parallax optionally if you want that. So you're going to be editing the camera and how the different movement works with the image that you're working with. And then finally, we're going to make it look even better by adding some visual effects to it to kind of enhance the results that you have. And then below that, we just have some miscellaneous comps that work in the background for you. You don't really have to pay attention to any of these, but that's where if there's a comp that you're trying to get to that you don't quite know where it's at, it's in the miscellaneous comps. So one of the cool things about this project is that if you understand how one element works of it, all the modules work the exact same, and you'll kind of understand the basic idea of how to edit everything in the project. So what I'm going to be doing in this demo is I'm going to be recreating this scene, because this scene is kind of special that it includes all the different features of all the different modules in one, and it has really nice depth of field. It's actually the original image that I was working with when I created the project, so there's a lot of value to this particular one. So we're going to be recreating this scene in the upcoming tutorials, and I'm going to be giving you a bunch of tips and any advice that I can give you to help make yours look as great as possible. In this video, we're going to be working with inserting our source footage, our step 1 of recreating this scene from the demo. Now, before we jump into the project, I just want to explain really quick what we're going to be doing in step 1 of inserting the primary, secondary, and optionally background. So I'm going to grab this image, and it'll give you a good example of what I'm referencing with the primary and secondary image. So the primary image that we're working with is basically, think of it as the silhouette or the main outline of the double exposure that we're going to be working with. The cool thing about this kit is that you don't necessarily have to have the background be perfectly white. And that's actually kind of unique to this project because most projects have you have a studio with a white background and a perfect silhouette of something to automatically work with. And I didn't want to make a project like that. I wanted it to be something that you could still isolate the primary source without it being perfectly white from the main source that we're working with. So again, the primary source is the main silhouette that we're going to be working with, the main object that we're going to be isolating. And then the secondary image is what's going to be exposed on top of that primary source as kind of like a cutout of it. So you can see here that that is the secondary source. In some examples, you might want a different background than you have of the primary and secondary source. So for example, in this image, we have 3 different elements. We have the primary, which is the surfer, and you can see that that's the primary because that's the main silhouette that we're going to be working with. We have a secondary, which is the image overlaying the secondary, and then finally we have a background optionally. Now you could do this with this being the background or with this being the background as well. It doesn't really matter. I just wanted to showcase that you can create something that has a different background than the primary source with the secondary overlaid. Now there is one more thing I want to explain, and that is using video in this project. So I'm going to bring back up the Fox double exposure that we have, and the best way to do this in this project is to not have the primary source of video, but instead the secondary source video, because of the fact that if the Fox was in motion, you're going to have to isolate it frame by frame, which is kind of a pain, and we don't want to have to do that. So for example, if the Fox is static, but this moves, that's perfectly fine. And in the project, I actually have a way to animate the secondary one so that it can move position or scale or whatever to look like it's moving. And that just adds a little bit more motion into our double exposure, which is what we're looking for. But as far as video goes in this project, I'm just going to stick to having the primary source as a photo and optionally the secondary source as a video. So let's dig into our project. So I'm going to go to a fresh copy and I'm going to go to module 1 and I'm going to twirl that down. And then I'm going to go to module steps and insert source. Now we're going to be inserting our primary source and our secondary source and optionally our background source. So you're going to want to import your footage, Command I, if you're working with a PC, Control I, and import your footage into After Effects. And then we're going to go to, I have the image already imported into here, so we're just going to go to Images and then Stock Photos and Female. And okay, now what I want you to do is double click so we're in our primary source 1 comp. And you'll notice right away in this comp that there's actually a red rectangle in there. And I don't want you to pay too much attention to this. That's more so important later in the project. But just know for right now that we have a rectangle that's 3000 pixels by 3000 pixels that we're working with in the primary source comp. So now I want you to go to your image and I want you to take your image and drop it in the timeline. Don't drop it in here. You can do that. But the reason why I want you to drop it in the timeline is because I want it to be centered. Now this image is perfectly worked out to be 3000 by 3000, but most images are not that size. So let's say, for example, that if I hit S for scale, that your image was larger than this area. What I'd want you to do is scale your image down to fit within there. And let's say that your image, I'll distort this for a second. Let's say that your image is like this. What I want you to do is scale this down so that it fits within that box. Don't worry about the white space. I just want the image to be as large as possible while fitting in the box. Let's say that if you import your image, it's this size. Well, first off, I would recommend to be at least working with an image 1920 by 1080. So as a general rule of thumb, it's best to work with images that are larger than the red rectangle. Okay? But if your image is smaller, I don't want you to scale up the image to fit. I just want you to leave it in there as is if it's smaller than the white rectangle that we're working with. Okay, so I'll undo all that. We'll get it to fit back in the box. And now we're going to do the exact same thing for our secondary source. So we're going to go down to secondary source, double click into there, and then we're going to insert our city into that. So I'm going to go back to the images, back to the city stock footage, and I'm going to select the secondary source and drop that in. And this one is larger, so we're going to hit S for scale and scale that down so that it fits within there. All right, and that is the basic idea for inserting your source. It's that simple. Now we have our primary source in and we have our secondary source in. And for this example, I can show you that we actually are going to be using the primary background with this as well. So unlike the example you saw earlier with the unique background, we're just going to be using the main source's background. So let's dig into our next step, which is going to be isolating the elements. Now, before we dig into the actual isolation methods, I just want to quickly go over with you an overview of what we're going to be discussing. So what do we mean by fine detail? Well, I'll bring up an image and you can see in this image that we have a lot of fine detail in this hair. And that's really hard to isolate using the broad methods like the pen tool and the magic wand tool. It doesn't do a very good job of getting inside the nooks and crannies to isolate just the hair. Now with the broad tools available to you for an image like this, they might work better than the fine details. If we're just trying to select the flower and the dragonfly, and obviously the wings have more detail in them, but if we're just trying to isolate, then it's not too difficult to isolate these two because there's really strong contrast in them and there's not a lot of fine details or pixel variants that we have to select. Now sometimes you'll run into images that kind of are in the middle, like this one, where there's a lot of detail in them, but it's also very geometric shape, so it's not difficult to select with the pen tool. So in this instance, it doesn't really matter. You could use the pen tool if you want, or a broad selection method, or you could use one of the ways of fine details, like using the Photoshop method or the rotobrush. And you don't always have to get a really tight isolation with it. You can sometimes just get a broad isolation and get awesome results with your double exposures. It just kind of depends on the circumstance that you're working with. Like for example, with this, if you wanted a separate background from this, then you would have to isolate the female. And if you didn't get the small details, the fine details in there, then you'd be able to tell that it's from a different image. And we don't want that illusion to come across in our double exposures. So then you would have to use one of the fine detail methods to isolate the female. So now that we've went over kind of an overview of the different versions of After Effects and what you have available to you, let's dig into the first tool, which is using the rotobrush tool. So now that we have our sources inserted, we're going to be isolating the primary source that we want double exposed. And the first way is using the rotobrush tool. And I'm going to explain in detail how to use that tool in this tutorial. Let's go into step 2, isolating the different elements. So twirl that down and go to primary isolation 1, double click into there. Now, once we're within this comp, I want to explain quickly what the rotobrush does. If you're familiar with the magic wand tool in Photoshop, you'll be familiar with how the rotobrush tool works. Basically what it does is you select a region, and then based on the pixels that you selected, it selects like pixels. You're going to use the tool to select regions that you want to isolate and then fine-tune those results and help the tool to learn what pixels you want and don't want. So that's a rough explanation of how the tool works, and we'll dig into it in just a second, but there's a couple things I want you to set up before you begin using the rotobrush tool. And the first thing is I want to make sure that you're working in full resolution mode. So in your composition panel, on the bottom in the middle, make sure that this is on full, not on half or third or quarter, full. And quickly, the reason for that is when you're working with the rotobrush tool, it actually calculates based on the resolution you're working with, which could become a problem when you're rendering and it's going into full resolution. So just note, you want to be working in full resolution to get the best results from the rotobrush tool. The next thing I want you to note is that we're actually working on frame 0. And if you try to move the current time indicator, you can't move it. And that's on purpose. I don't want you to be able to move the current time indicator. This is important because I want to be only working on frame 0. And finally, if you're not seeing this toolbar on the top, on a Mac hit Command 1 and on a PC Control 1. And that'll bring up this toolbar. And this is the tool that we're going to be working with, the rotobrush tool. And now if you click and hold on that, you can see that there's actually a couple options. There's the rotobrush tool and there's the refine edge tool. We're going to be working with the rotobrush tool. We'll be working with the refine edge tool in a minute after we're done rotoscoping out our object. So let's begin using the rotobrush tool. So the workflow to using this is you want to select the tool. So make sure that's highlighted. That's very important that the tool is selected before you begin. And then I want you to double click on your primary source, and that will bring up a new layer panel, and that'll bring up a new layer panel. Now, the first thing I want to note with this is when you're in this mode, there's a couple different buttons down here for toggling the alpha. I want you to be working with the middle one here, where it has the purple outline with it. Don't worry about these other two beside it. I want you to make sure you're just working in the pink middle one. Okay, now there are two things I want to explain how to do with the rotobrush tool before we begin actually selecting the pixels. And that is, I want to teach you how to change the brush size and how to deselect. So how to change the brush size, you hold Command on a Mac, Control on a PC, and then left mouse click and drag up or down to change the size of the brush that we're working with. And then the other thing I want you to know is how to deselect. So as of right now, it should be green, the brush that you're working with. If you hold Option on a Mac or Alt on a PC, you'll see that that changes to a red negative, which means we're deselecting. By default, it's selecting in the green, and if you hold Option, Alt on a PC, you're deselecting. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be making a rough outline in the beginning. So I'm going to take the brush size by holding Command and dragging down to make it a little bit smaller, and I'm just going to make a rough outline of the figure that we want to isolate. So it did a really good job right away, but you can see, like right here, for example, that I got just a little bit confused about the pixels that we're working with on here. So now what you're going to be doing is you're going to be helping the tool by selecting more pixels close to the edge to help refine that. So it did a pretty good job, except for right here, it grabbed too many pixels. So now I want you to hold Option on a Mac or Control on a PC and deselect that area. And the more you fine tune your results, the better you get. So let's go down here to the bottom of the dress. I'm gonna make the brush size by holding Command or Control on a PC, dragging down, and I'm gonna select the pixels within the dress. And now you can see that it actually grabbed way too many pixels, so we're going to have to help it out again. So we're going to hold Command, and I'm going to make that a little bit smaller. And then holding Option or Alt to deselect, I'm going to click and drag and deselect around the area that I don't want those pixels to be included. And then finally, let's help out her feet down here. There. So that's a pretty decent outline. It's not great, but it's good for step 1 of this. Now the next step is we're going to be using the Refine Edge tool to fine tune the edge results. So now what I want you to do is go back to the tool on the top, click, hold, and then select the Refine Edge tool. And you could also hit the hotkey Option W or Alt W on a PC, and that'll switch between the rotobrush tool and the Refine Edge tool. Now the best way to be using this is to have your brush size about as big as mine is right now compared to this object. You don't want it too large because it's not going to give you good results. You don't want it too small, otherwise you're going to have a hard time staying on the edge. You want it about this size, and you want to keep the crosshairs on it right on the pink. You want it to be right in the middle of the outline that you're creating. So I'm going to do an example of that. I'm going to select, and it's going to think about the pixels that I selected. And now what it's doing is it's creating a matte. So all the pixels that are white are going to be included in the final result, and all the pixels that are black are going to not be included. So this worked pretty well, but it is selecting some pixels that we don't want. So now, just like using the rotobrush tool, there's a deselect feature with the Refine Edge tool, and that is by holding Option. You can see that we have a minus sign, which means to deselect, and we're going to deselect some of the pixels around where we don't want it selected. So you can kind of fine tune this as much as you want. If you want really crisp results, you have to go in and do it this way. So making sure we're on the Refine Edge tool, I'm just going to select around the object. And it's going to think for a second about the pixels that we're selecting. And just for this demonstration's sake, it's doing a pretty good job. I'm not going to get too worried about it right now. The more you want to work with it and refine your results by helping selecting or deselecting pixels around the edge, the better your results are going to be. You want to use the Refine Edge tool on like pixels. So for example, if I undo that, you can see that where her hair starts gets to be significantly darker pixels than these pixels. So what you would do then is you would use the Refine Edge tool on these pixels up to about right there, and then use the Refine Edge tool again on these pixels. And then again here, because those are kind of like pixels with the dress. And then here, you want to use it. These are kind of all like pixels with the darkness of her legs. And I'm just going to speed up the footage a little bit so that you can see what it is that I'm doing. So I use the Refine Edge tool on all the edges. I'm going to fine tune just one spot that got a little bit rough. I'm going to hold Option on a Mac, Alt on a PC, and deselect those pixels within the dress to the legs. There, and they did a really good job of cleaning up those pixels that we didn't want. And additionally with this, you can fine tune the results even more by editing the Effect Controls panel within this. And if you're not seeing the Effect Controls panel, go to Window, Effect Controls, and you can see here that we have the rotobrush and Refine Edge effect options. And you can adjust these to whatever you want with your image. As a general rule of thumb though, for most of your images, I would say to not touch most of these, except for possibly the smooth, the feather, and the contrast, and don't have the values too high on these. I would suggest not having the smooth much higher than 10, the feather same, not much higher than 10 as well, and the contrast not much higher than 20 on the Refine Edge map. Otherwise you start to get really blurry results. All right, so that's everything for the rotobrush tool. I know we went a little bit fast, but I tried to cover everything in here. So let's dig into the next way of isolating an element, which is using the pen tool. In this video, we're going to go over how to isolate elements using the pen tool. If you're familiar with Photoshop or Illustrator, you're probably pretty familiar with the pen tool. And it's no different in After Effects. It's just a matter of where it's at and how it works and if there's any little quirks that are different. And there are a couple small ones that we're going to be going over. But for the most part, the pen tool is a really simple tool to work with. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be selecting the pen tool first, and if you're not seeing the toolbar, hit Command 1 or Control 1 and select the pen tool. It's right here in the middle. And if you click and hold on that, you can see that we have most of the same options that are in other programs. We have the main tool, we have the Add Vertex tool, Delete Vertex tool, Convert tool, and the Mask Feather tool. Now really you only have to worry about the pen tool for right now. Now before I dig into using the pen tool on the object that we're going to be isolating, I just want to make a quick example of how this works. So using the pen tool, you can select points, And then with those points, when you close the points and go back to the beginning of the first vertices that you selected, it masks or it isolates that area. Now, if I undo those and I go back to the first vertices and click and hold and drag, you can see that I can fine tune the curve or the angle that these 2 points connect. So if you just select, it'll do a linear to there. And if I undo those, you can see that if I hold, then I can create Bezier points or curved points from one to another. Now this comes in really handy for selecting larger objects, but once you get into more fine-tuned spots, like hair for example, it's not quite as easy. So we'll go over that in just a minute, but just know for a rule of thumb that the pen tool is really good at isolating, and you can fine-tune the vertices points really easily. So now that we know how to use the pen tool and how it kind of works with clicking and dragging and being able to make Bezier points versus linear points, I'm going to go in and I'm going to, let's isolate her legs first. So I'm going to begin here and I'm going to make another point here. I'm going to click and drag because there's a little bit of a curve in her leg right there. And there's a bigger curve right here. So we're just going to click and drag and select that. And then we'll go down and maybe right here. It's not too scientific, just wherever you think you can make a nice curved line from. So once we get around the toe, I'm just going to zoom in a little bit more. I'm going to select the other side. Okay, so now we get around the toe, but now we want to create a point here. But wait a second, this is in the wrong spot. So you can either do one of two things. You can either just grab the handle, but that moves both points, or I'll undo that. You can hold Option on a Mac or Control on a PC, and that allows you to grab the handles individually. And again, you can get as detailed as you want with the shape of this. I'm just going around. Pretty simple so far. We'll make another point here. See, you could make a point here, 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 or you could get better results by just recognizing that you can make a nice curve right there, Bezier curve. And we'll just keep going around. All right, now we get to the spot that's a little bit trickier, the hair. What do you do with an object that's really detailed like this if you're trying to isolate it? Well, my recommendation would be to treat these as separate objects. So treat the really fine-tuned objects and the really sharp objects separately and make a separate mask just for those. So we'll just continue on, and I'm just going to kind of go really fast around here. I'm not going to get too detailed. So now we have a really rough outline of the figure that we're working with. What you want to do is select the layer and hit MM really quickly. And you can see that we have some mask options that are on that layer. So the first thing is the add or subtract. With the mask that we just created, do we want to add the object or isolate within the boundaries that we created, or do we want to subtract or select the boundary outside of the area that we just selected? So those are the two things you want to note, add or subtract. Most of the time we're going to be working with add. You want to isolate the object within the pen tool points that we created. And then the other thing to note is the feather. Now, as a general rule of thumb, you always want to have some sort of a feather. And I'll turn this way up so you can see what's happening. It's just making a really soft edge. So the higher up you go, the softer the edge will be that it's selecting. If anything, I'd probably go 2 or 3 for most images, depending on the scenario. Okay, so this looks pretty good, but it looks like we got a little bit sharp on this angle right here. So how would you go in and fix it? Hold the mouse down on that tool and select Add Vertex tool. We can add more points into our selection. We can do the same by using the Delete Vertex tool, where we can remove points. All right, and then we have the Convert Vertex tool. Now this basically allows you to select a point, and you can click and drag and fine tune it that way. Or just grab one of the points when you have the selection tool selected, and you can grab the handlebars if you want that way. Now, in order to fine tune the results, and this is one thing that kind of trips people up, is if you have the selection tool selected and you go to move the bars, both of the handles will move. But if you try to use the option trick like I told you about earlier, it's not letting you select the handles individually. And I can understand how that gets really frustrating for people. The reason why it's not working is because you want to have the pen tool selected. So go back to the pen tool. Now, if you select one of the points and you want to fine tune it, now if you hold option and you grab one of the handles, you can individually move them around. So that's the basics of how to use the pen tool. So let's go in and finish the job by adding the hair back in. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be creating another mask. So with the layer selected, I'm going to go back to the pen tool and I'm going to create another matte right there. And I'll take these 2 points, I'm going to hit V, and then I'm going to grab both of these holding shift. I'm going to bring it down to maybe like right about there. Now the other way, I knew that the hair was there from before, but let's say that I kind of forgot where it was. You could go to the primary source, hit MM, and then instead of add, hit none, and that'll make it so you can see the entire area. Now I'll make another matte. Go to the pen tool, and then maybe start out here, 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 there. All right, and then the next step that I want to do is hit MM so I can see both of the masks that we have, all the options within those. And I'm going to go back instead of none to add, so it's kind of how we had originally. And then with a new mask that we created, I'm going to go to the feather and turn the feather up. All right, and then the last thing I want to do in this example is I would not want it this sharp. So I would take the feather and put it at like 20 or something like that, maybe a little bit more. It doesn't need to be that sharp, especially for the example that we're using where we're having the object not be isolated. It's going to actually have the main background from the image in there. So that is how to use the pen tool. There's no way around it. If you're going to use After Effects, you have to know how to use the pen tool. It's just one of those crucial tools to creating motion graphics, is being able to mask sources and isolate sources that if you're not familiar with how to use the pen tool, just get some practice. And this is a great project to get practice using it. And as a final thought for isolating the elements with the pen tool, you don't necessarily have to get a solid outline. Like, you don't necessarily have to get a really detailed outline. You could, I'll just delete these 2 masks, and you could just go in with the pen tool, and let's say you just selected this area, and then we hit MM, and then we turn the feather up. That right there could be all you need for your double exposure. You wouldn't necessarily need to create a detailed mask or use the rotobrush tool. You could just do this and then dig into editing the double exposure. All right, so let's dig into the next tutorial, how to isolate elements in Photoshop. In this video, I'm going to go over how to isolate elements in Photoshop. And it's a really simple workflow. So let's all make sure that we're in the same spot. We're in primary isolation 1. We have our sources inserted. And now what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating a single frame from our primary source. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Command-Shift-S. But before I do that, one very important step, you want to make sure your resolution is on full. Because when we create a single frame that we're going to be outputting, we want to make sure that it's at full resolution. And if this is set at half or third, it's going to be much smaller than the full size single frame. So make sure this is on full. So now we'll hit Option-Command-S, on a PC Option-Control-S, and we want to make sure this says PNG single frame. And yours might say JPEG single frame, but either way, it'll come up as a single frame that we're going to be rendering. Now we want to change our output location to something unique where the original file is located, but then creating a new folder titled Isolated so that you can differentiate the original image that we're working with compared to the new image that we're creating with this single frame. So what I'll just do is I'll rename this Module 1 Primary Isolation. Doesn't really matter. And then we'll hit Render in our render queue. And then we'll go to the image that we just rendered out. We'll take that, Module 1 Primary Isolation, and we'll drag that into Photoshop. So let's go over the first way of isolating the elements using the color range. Now in this particular example, that method wouldn't work very well, but let's go over one that would work well, this one with the hair. So I'll bring that into Photoshop. And now let's say for that cosmic example where we have the stars in her hair, if you wanted to use this method, I'll just create a new layer from this by hitting Command-J, and that'll duplicate that layer, or Control-J on a PC. And then what I'm going to do is go to Select Color Range. And I'll drag this over a little bit. And then it brings up an eyedrop tool where we can select the different methods, and we can see in this box a matte of what it is that we're selecting. So this looks pretty good. I'll hit OK. And now what you want to do is either hit Command-J, Control-J, and that will create a new layer based on the selection that we just had. Or you can select right down here in the bottom right. This creates a mask that if I turn the bottom layer off, you can see that we now have the isolated hair or the isolated element that we want selected. So that's the first way of isolating elements in Photoshop. I'll undo that and go back to the beginning. Now the next way of isolating elements in Photoshop I'm going to recommend is using the Quick Selection tool and then using the Refine Edge tool once we have that selected. So what we're going to do is go to the left-hand panel and then go to this tool right here. I'm going to click and hold on it so you can see that there's actually a tool underneath it. So we have the Magic Wand tool and the Quick Selection tool. We want to release once our mouse is on the Quick Selection tool. Then what we're going to do is very similar to the Refine Edge tutorial that we just went over. We're going to zoom in a little bit. So I'm going to hold Option on a Mac or Control on a PC and just zoom my mouse in. And then I'm just going to, holding the left mouse with the tool selected, select the basic shape of the object that we're trying to isolate. Zoom in a little bit more because we want to deselect this area. Now to deselect, you hold Option on a Mac or Control on a PC and you can deselect that area. I'm going to deselect within here. If you want to make, I'll zoom out by holding Option on a Mac and zooming back. If you want to make it larger, you can hit right bracket and that'll make the tool larger, or left bracket and that will make the tool smaller. And those are found just above the return key to the left, the right bracket and left bracket. All right, so I'll go back in just a little bit more and fine tune. So we have a pretty good selection right now. Now what we want to do is we want to use the Refine Edge feature. So you can either on a Mac hit Command Option R is the shortcut for that, Control Option R on a PC, or you can click on this button up here, Refine Edge. And this kind of brings up a mode similar to what we saw with the rotobrush tool. So I'm going to hit Smart Radius on here, and I'm going to change the radius on this edge detection, maybe something like 5 pixels. And I'm going to make this brush larger, so I'm going to do right bracket, and we're just going to paint around the edges. And this is going to do a pretty good job, just like the rotobrush tool, of getting the fine-tuned details in our image. So the better job we do of isolating the elements in the first place, and we can go through, and I'll make this tool a little bit smaller, and I'll hold Option again, and deselect some of these areas. And the more we kind of fine tune back and forth, the better the results we're going to get for the edges. So we have a more fine-tuned outline now of the object that we're trying to isolate. So now what we're going to do is hit OK. And then this will just kind of show that we have our selection visible here. And it's not that accurate, but it gives you a quick idea of the selection that we have. And we're going to create a new layer based on the selection we just had. So I'm going to hit Command J. Rather than using the hotkey, you could also go to Layer, New, Layer via Copy. And that's the same thing. Then what you want to do is turn off the bottom layer so that we have the layer isolated. And I'm going to go to File, Save. And I always like to save the Photoshop document just in case I need to go back and change something, but you don't have to do that in this example. I'll just go to the format options and change it to PNG. It's very important that we choose a transparent option for this. So we can't use JPEG or any other option that doesn't allow transparency. We need to use either PNG or you could use a Photoshop file, but the file sizes get kind of large sometimes when using Photoshop documents with the different layers. So we'll just use PNG. And I'm just going to rename this Isolated so that we know that it's different than the original one that we started with. Now that we're done in Photoshop, all we have to do is just import that object into After Effects and place it where it needs to go. So I'll bring it into Images and I'll put it where the other female image is in there. I'll hit Command I, and then we'll go to our file we just created. So Module 1 Primary Isolation Isolated, and hit Open. And then all we have to do is drag that into our timeline and disable the original source that we were working with. And now we have our object isolated. Now that we have our objects isolated, the next step is going to be editing the double exposure. So we get to the fun part basically. And with this step, what I did just now was I created a mask around the whole thing with the pen tool. And it's pretty rough. It just has a feathering of 60 pixels on there. So let's go into Module 1, Steps, and go to Edit Double Exposure in Step 3. And we'll double click into there. Now, the first thing I want to note in this composition is that the colors on here are kind of important. Within this whole project, anytime you see green, that means that the layer is a controller layer. And anytime that you see cyan or this bluish color, that means that it's a layer that you can edit, or there's something on that layer that you can edit. So if we go to the green layer, the layout controller, you'll see that we have a whole bunch of options within there for the layout options for our double exposure, and the CC, the color correction controller. Let's dig into the layout controller first. We have the master position. Just know for this that it moves everything within the project over. Same for the scale and the rotation. Now we have these separators in here just to kind of differentiate the different sections of effects that we're going through. And again, if you're not seeing the effects control panel, go to Window and Effect Controls. Now we have two options within the next category: enable primary background or enable secondary background. So you get to kind of choose. If you select there, you'll see that now our primary background is back in action. And if we uncheck that and check the secondary background, you can see that we have our secondary source that we were working with as the background. So it kind of depends on what the image or look that you're going for is. So we'll uncheck that, and we want in this example to be using the primary background. The next set of options relate to the primary position. So you can move independently the position of the primary object around without moving the secondary source that we have. Same goes for scale, opacity, and rotation. And then below that, we have the secondary options for the position. So if you want to move the double exposed image that we're working with around, and same scale, opacity, and rotation for those. The next set of options we have relate to the background color. Now, if you're using the primary or the secondary source as the background, you don't have to worry about these options. But if we disable that, you can see that we actually do have a gradient behind there. So we have the background gradient color A and B, and by default I have them at white, but if we change it to a different color, you can see that we actually do have a gradient behind there. And then you can change where the points are for that as well. If you move that over, you can see that we can make the gradient shift position or make it larger or smaller. And then we also have the custom background position. So let's say that you did have a custom background, like in this example where there's a third source, the background, then you can move that around independently of the primary and the secondary sources. And then the last set of options that we have within there, you can individually adjust the opacity of the background from the primary or the secondary. So I know that it gets a little bit deep, but all these options are really crucial to really fine tune exactly the look that you want for your double exposure. So let's undo back to the beginning so that we're fresh of when we open the project. The first thing I want you to note is that what you're seeing within the rectangle is what you're going to be seeing for the final result. So the layout is actually larger in this than what you're going to be seeing at the end, and that helps to give you more options when you're moving stuff around or editing the layout of your double exposure. So let's recreate that scene from the demo because it's looking a little bit rough right now, but give it a second and we'll get it looking a lot nicer. So we're going to enable the primary background, and then we're going to scale it down because it's quite a bit larger than the example that we have in the demo. So something like that is pretty close to the size that we were working with. Now we're going to move the secondary position because we kind of had like the city, the top of it right there. So we'll move that up. There, it's pretty close to that. So now we have the layout relatively how we want it. We can fine tune a little bit later, but the next thing we have to do is we have to adjust the double exposure itself. And how we're going to be doing that is I have this layer, this red matte layer set up for you. And if you select that, you'll see that the mask comes up for that layer. And you'll notice that it has a note in here, adjust this matte to reveal double exposure. So if I hit V and I double click on one of the points, I can move that around. And by doing that, I can reveal where, since we isolated the primary source, where I want the double exposure to happen at. And there's a few cool things you can do with the setup this way using the primary matte to expose the double exposure. If you hit MM with the primary matte highlighted, you can see that we have the same mask options. And if you adjust this, you can actually feather the double exposure even more. And feel free to take the mask and move it around to wherever you want. And you can definitely take and make another mask around and create multiple masks for your double exposure to kind of fine tune exactly how you want it to look. So you could create another mask. You could adjust the points that are in the mask that are already have set up for you. There's all kinds of ways you can get to fine tune the results to get them exactly how you want them. All right, so to get this looking a little bit closer to the demo, I'm noticing that the scale of the secondary image is a little bit too large. So let's take the secondary scale and scale that down. So that's a little bit closer to how it was in the demo. And then we'll move the position a little bit farther over to the left, because actually you can see right here, we're looking at the edge of the image and we don't want to have the viewer see that. So something right around there and up. And this is a good time too to mention when you're animating the secondary position, like I did in the demo with all the different options when they move while the object is moving. You're gonna wanna do that right in this composition. So if you want, for example, to move this over to the left or to the right, all you'd have to do is just put the current time indicator at the beginning on frame 0, and then we're gonna set a keyframe on the secondary position. Now you can hit U and you can see that keyframe on the timeline, and we're going to bring our current time indicator to where we want our animation to end at. And just a quick note for this as well, most of the project is set up to be the final result at 5 seconds. And in the last tutorial, I'm going to explain how to extend it to 10 seconds pretty easily, and beyond 10 seconds if you want. But just know for right now that we're going to be working with something that's going to be 5 seconds. And the whole project is set up at 30 frames per second. So at 150 frames, that would be 5 seconds. So we'll bring our current time indicator to frame 150, and we'll just move the secondary position keyframe over. And you don't have to get too extreme with this either. You can just do something, like 100, 200 pixels max for animating the position left or right. You can animate the scale, you can animate the opacity, whatever you think. Like for example, with the skull in the demo, that's how I did that, was I just animated the opacity. One other thing you can animate is you can animate the opacity of the matte as well. So if I go to the primary matte layer and I hit T, you can see that on this opacity, you can set a keyframe on here, and I'll drag that to the beginning, and then you could have that go to 150, and then you could have that go away. So there's all kinds of things you can do to fine tune the double exposure. So now we know how to animate the double exposure, and we know how to animate the matte that reveals the double exposure. So let's continue on. I'm going to delete these keyframes and delete this one. And we'll move on to the next layer, which is the controller layer, the CC controller, or color correction controller. So if I twirl these up, you can see that we have two categories. We have the primary color correction and the secondary image color correction. And in my opinion, you can get most image to look relatively close to how you want from those three options. So that's why I included those specific ones in there. So one of the things is with the secondary image, or the double exposed image that's on top of there, we want to select that and twirl it down on the hue and saturation and bring the saturation down, so it kind of matches the scene that we're working with. So now we're getting really close to how the demo looked. And you can fine tune the curves on these if you want to increase the contrast or decrease the contrast, whatever you want to do for your double exposure. Now, the very last thing I want to go over with this is that sometimes you'll have objects that you don't quite want in your result. Like on the edges, for example, you'll have part of your double exposure come up, and you want to fine tune those results a little bit more. And I noticed it when we had the hue and saturation up to 0, that there starts to be results like maybe down here that we don't quite want those. So the best way to get rid of those is actually to mask them out. So the way you're going to be doing that is you're going to be selecting layer 6, the secondary matte, and you're going to hit G or go up to the top and select the pen tool. And you're just going to select the area that you don't want the double exposure to be visible at. Now, by default, it isolates that, it adds that, and we don't want that. We want it to subtract that or deselect that area. So we're going to hit MM with that layer highlighted, and that's going to bring up our mask properties. And then we're just going to go, instead of add, to subtract. And always add a little bit of a feather on there so that you don't see a harsh edge. And that's how we're going to get rid of some of the small details that we might not want for the double exposure showing up where we don't want it to. All right, so we'll go back to the color controller and we'll bring that back down to 0. And that is the basic double exposure that we have for the project. All right, we are almost there. We have our double exposure. It looks almost identical to the one in the demo at this step anyways. So in the next video, we're going to be going over how to edit the parallax within the project. I'm really excited to announce version 3 is ready to go. And there's a bunch of really cool new features that I want to go over with you. So in this video, I'm just going to go over a basic overview of all the new stuff that I added. The next update, we have to go to the Add Effects composition. And within this comp now, there is another checkbox on the top of any of the effects. And you have to enable this if you want to use any of the elements within that. So let's say, for example, if you want the Enable Water Grunge, you have to have the AE textures enabled and then enable the water grunge as well. And the reason for this double checkbox system is just that it actually makes After Effects run a little bit faster with the way that I have the project set up. And like I said, I'm really trying with this update to make it as efficient as possible and make After Effects run as quickly as possible. And for that matter, I also want to mention right now too that whenever you're working with this project, I'm recommending to use half. It makes it run significantly faster having the resolution right here set to half rather than full. So all the comps are by default set to half. And I think that, and just for the speed and performance and the preview quality, it's just by far the best setting. So use half. That's my recommendation for you when you're editing your double exposures. And the next two updates I want to go over are just really minor things. The first one being that now when you click on any of the different modules in the main project file, you see some text. It tells you what comp you're in and where to go to begin the double exposure and also where the tutorials are. And that's just so basically you're not seeing a white composition completely blank. It's giving you some sort of a direction of where to go to and where the tutorials are. So whenever you're beginning a new module, just go into the module and delete this layer. All right. And then finally, the last thing is if you go into the effects and into the parallax editor, I want to note that if you hit U on here before, I had there being a rotation R, a rotation happening by default, and I disabled that because a lot of people were kind of getting tripped up about camera rotation. And so I still recommend to have it go no more than 1 or 2 degrees, like I mentioned in the other parallax tutorial. But just note by default that that is disabled. So if you want that, you're going to have to add that in. All right. Those are the main updates for version 3. In the next video, I'm going to go over exactly how to edit the new parallax system and some best practices to get you the best results possible. All right, guys, in this video, I'm going to go over exactly how to edit the Double Exposure Kit version 3 update parallax. And it's a really exciting new feature that allows you to get really interesting depth with your characters or objects that you're isolating. And in this first part, I'm going to go over how to add parallax to the primary object. So in this example, the female. And then the second video, I'm going to go over how to add parallax to the secondary object. So in this example, the city. And if we scrub the timeline here, you can see what's happening is her arm is actually coming at us a little bit faster than the rest of her body. And that's creating a really rich illusion of depth in the image. And the cool thing about this technique is that you can actually use it as the element on the primary object. So you can have the female coming at you with her arm, for example, a little bit faster, or you could isolate the city, the secondary source, and have the parallax happening with that. And I did both examples in the demo to kind of showcase how you could use them. And I also want to mention that I'm not using displacement maps, and I'm not going to get into too much detail about displacement maps, but I actually don't like that method for doing double exposures. I feel like the method that I'm going to show you gives you a much richer depth and is easier for the depth of field than the other methods that are available in the marketplace and on tutorials that you watch. So let's dig into this. Go to your parallax editor, and within here now we have our new layers that we're working with. We have these pink layers, and this is where all the magic is happening. Now, a quick overview of what we're going to be doing is we're going to, via masks, we're going to be selecting roughly areas that we want to be closer and further and further and farthest away from us in Z space. If you click on P, on this parallax base layer, you can see that Z space of 4000, and then on 6, it's in 3500. So as we go up with these layers, it's progressively getting closer to us in Z space. Now you can see if you highlight some of these that I have some masks set up on here. And if you look at these tags, it says front mask and back mask. So how I'm going to have you work is I want you to go backwards. I want you to start from the furthest distance back and then work your way to the front. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight all of these layers, and I'm going to disable them via the eye icon so we just have the base on. Now what I want you to do with your double exposure is I want you to think about what areas are closest to me and what areas are farthest away on my double exposure. So in this example of the female, I'm going to break this up into 3 parts. The first part is going to be the closest part to us is going to be her arm. And then the next closest thing to us is going to be her body. And then the farthest thing from us is going to be her legs. The first thing I want you to do is I want you to go to Parallax Extrude 6, and I want you to turn that layer on. Now, I recommend to always have Extrude 6 untouched. Turn it on and don't edit that one. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to turn Parallax Extrude 5 on. What we're going to be doing on here is, remember I said we have the three parts, the arm, the body, and the legs. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be selecting areas that we want visible, okay? So in Extrude 5, we want the legs, the body, and the arm all visible. Okay, so we can just leave Parallax Extrude 5 alone, but we'll consider this in the back of our mind, the legs layer. So then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go Parallax Extrude 4, and I'm going to turn that on. Now we're going to think of this layer as the body layer, and we want that to be the next closest layer to us in Z space. So I'm going to hit G, and if you have the feather come up, just hit G again, and that will bring up the other optional tool for the pen tool. And we're going to make a rough outline with our pen tool. And rough is the key word with this. It doesn't have to be that specific, okay? But what I want you to do now is go back to Parallax Extrude 4 and hit MM, and that will bring up the mask options. And I recommend with the feathering to be somewhere between 10 to 30. So we'll put this at 30 for right now. And what that's going to do is this is going to help out to kind of even out the mask that we add and ensure that it doesn't have a harsh edge to it. So we'll twirl that up. And let's reiterate what we've done so far. We have the Parallax Extrude 6 layer, and that one I always recommend to not touch, just leave that one alone. We have this Parallax Extrude 5 layer, and what this one is we're considering it's the leg layer, or the farthest back layer. And we don't have to add any isolation to this layer, because we want to think about these layers in terms of including. What do we want to include in Extrude 5? What do we want to include in Extrude 6? So in Parallax 5, we want to include everything, including the legs. In Parallax Extrude 4, we want to include the body and the arm and the head and the hair, everything in here. So now that brings us to Parallax Extrude 3, and we'll turn that on, and we want to include only the arm in this. So we'll hit G, and that'll bring up the pen tool, and we'll go around and make an outline of her arm. Doesn't have to be very exact. And now we'll go in and we'll hit MM. And we'll set the feathering to somewhere around 15, something like that. Now, roughly, that is the idea for all of these double exposures. You can see that just with what we've done right now, we've created a really nice parallax effect with our double exposure. Now, if you want to accentuate this even more, you can duplicate this with different layers. For example, I'm going to hit on Parallax Extrude 3. This is where we have the arm layer. I'm going to delete that mask, and I'm going to go to Parallax Extrude 4, hit M, and I'm going to select that mask and hit Command-C to copy it. I'm going to paste that mask onto Parallax Extrude 3. So now we have two layers that are her body layer. Now if we go to Parallax Extrude 2, we turn that on, we hit G, and we single out her arm. You can see that now the body's a little bit more accentuated than the earlier example. And in my experience from the demo and all the different ones I've created so far, 6 layers is more than enough to get the desired effect without having too many layers involved. Because if you have too many coming too close to the camera, it starts to not sell the illusion of the depth that we're creating. Now, the really cool thing about this effect is if you go to your camera controller and you enable the depth of field, okay? And I'll hit U on here, and I'll bring the current time indicator to the beginning. And you go to the camera aperture, and we bump this way up, something like 800, for example, okay? So that blurs out the whole scene. But now we bring the focus distance, and we bring that so it's just focusing on her arm. Now what we're going to do is we're going to bring our current time indicator to the end, to the keyframes, and I'm going to change the aperture again to match the other one, 800. You can set it to whatever you want. But we're going to bring the focus distance to focus in, pay attention to this end area back here, to the furthest distances back in Z space. So maybe like right about there. If we kind of scrub the timeline, you can see that what's happening is that the focal point is going from the arm, and then it's going back to the body. And that's creating this really, really polished illusion of depth that you just can't achieve without depth of field in it. And it also kind of helps to mask some of the lines that form as the camera gets closer. So it's a nice way to trick the viewer into not being able to see kind of the broken lines that happen as the camera gets closer to the object. In the next video, we're going to go over how to add parallax to the secondary source and also learn about the inverted parallax feature. In this video, I'm going to go over how to add parallax to your secondary object, or in this example, the city, and also going over the inverted parallax feature. So the first thing I can say is that we know that these buildings are closer than these buildings, and these buildings are closer than these buildings. So what we're going to be doing is we're always working backwards. We're starting out with the furthest back, and we're working our way towards the foreground. So let's disable all the layers, hitting Shift and selecting all the pink layers and hitting the eye icon and disabling them. And one by one, we're going to be working with them. So I'll hit the eye icon on Parallax Extrude 6, and we're going to leave this one alone. We're not touching Parallax Extrude 6. Now we get to Parallax Extrude 5, and we'll consider this the distant buildings in the background. Now, with the farthest back element that we want, we're not going to be adding any masks. We're just going to leave that one alone, but let's just consider this the far background buildings, okay? So Extrude 5 is the far background. Next, we're going to go to the Parallax Extrude 4. Now, what we're going to do with this is we're going to be isolating the middle ground and foreground into one. And then finally on Parallax Extrude 3, just jumping ahead a little bit to plan out what we're doing, we're going to be isolating just the foreground layers. So let's go back to 4 and let's isolate the middle buildings. And again, this can be pretty rough. There we go. And we'll hit MM. And we'll turn that to maybe 15, because they're a little bit more detailed in here. And then we'll go to Parallax Extrude 3. And now this is going to be our foreground. So remember, the base is the furthest back, and then we get progressively closer to the foreground as we go up. So I'll hit G again on here when this layer is highlighted. And this one we're just going to be isolating the foreground buildings. So these set right there. Hit MM. Maybe put this to 10. And let's see what we got. I think it looks pretty good. These buildings are obviously coming closer to us in Z space. And then these ones, and then in the far back, the other ones. All right, but let's say, for example, we wanted the foreground one to pop a little bit more than the rest of them. What we could do is just hit M on Extrude 3, copy that, Command C, that mask, turn on Parallax Extrude 2, and paste that onto there. So then that brings the front buildings even closer to us in Z space. And again, if we want to, we can add the depth of field on there. And then that adds that rack focus. We can see that the front buildings are sharp. And then as we move back, because we set this up earlier with the camera aperture and the focus distance in the previous tutorial, it's already set up for us. So that is the basic workflow. And you can see it's really simple. I don't want you to get too hung up on making perfect masks, because part of this is just efficiency. I wanted it to be quick for you to just make a quick isolation of an object that's being double exposed. Let's go over the last new parallax feature, which is the inverted parallax. So I'm going to turn off the depth of field for right now. And what I'm going to do is highlight all these layers, hit M, and delete the masks that we've created. And then I'm going to highlight all the pink layers and turn them off. Now, what I want you to do is to check out on the parallax space, hit P, and you can see that, again, that's at 4000 in Z space. But if we go to parallax invert 1 and we hit P, this is at 4500. So this is actually further back into Z space. All the extrudes that we've been working with up to this point have progressively gotten closer to the camera, but these are actually going away from the camera. Now, we're not seeing them for two reasons. The first is we have to enable them. So what we're going to do for that is go to the parallax controller and click enable, and I'll move this over so you can read it, enable inverted double exposure. And if we click on that, we can see that nothing happens. And the reasoning why we're not seeing it is actually because this base layer, this parallax base, is in front of our inverted parallax layers. If we disable this, we can see behind it that our double exposure is on the other side of this layer in Z space. So what we have to do is we kind of have to poke a hole in it in order to see what's happening behind it. So with our mask, I'm going to hit G, and then I'm going to make a rough mask here. and hit MM on that layer we just added a mask to. And I'm going to change this from add to subtract. And that's essentially kind of cutting a hole in the area that we want. And now if we add a feather to that, we can see in Z space, this layer is farther back. So that's the basic idea, is we're poking holes in layers. And you can kind of see the power in that, for example, where if we do that, and then in the parallax invert 1, we add a mask to this building. Okay, so just kind of roughly, we're adding a mask to that. Now, you can see that we're actually adding parallax to the buildings farther back. So honestly, for the most part, you don't even really have to worry about the inverted parallax features. I just could see some people wanting that feature, but in general, for 98% of your double exposures, just using these extrudes will work out just fine for you. All right, and that is everything for editing the parallax. We just have one more tutorial to go and we are all done, and that is adding effects. All right, you guys, we're on the final tutorial, adding effects. And this is a really fun tutorial because it's really just taking your results and making them look even more polished. So what we're gonna be doing is going to step 5 in our project panel, adding effects, double click into there. And within here, you can see that first off, the colors changed just a little bit. And that's because I have this final CC, final color correct layer, where you can adjust the curves at the very end of the project. And it just kind of helps to bring it all together. And if you want any final adjustments, this is where you would do that with the color. Now below that, we have a bunch of different controller layers, green layers. And within those, we have a ton of options. And I added all the options in for you to be able to fine tune it exactly how you wanted the end result to look. Because that's how I would want it if I was purchasing this. I would want tons of different effects and ways that I can kind of make it my own. So I want to skip over the matte controller for just a second, and I want to go to the static textures, because this is probably one of the most used controller layers you're going to be working with. So we have this enable metal 1, enable metal 2, all these different options. And we're familiar with this setup because we have the divider, and that's indicating that it's a separate category. So let's enable metal 1. Now, the first thing you'll see when you turn this on is that it looks ridiculous, and that's by default. I wanted you to be able to very clearly see that something was happening in the scene. So by default, I wanted you, the first thing to do is edit the opacity. And it's no fun to turn an effect on and not see anything happen. And that's what happens most of the time with people's projects. And I don't like that. I want to see something happening and then scale it down from there. So what I would recommend is most of these, especially for the textures, once they're on, to put them at like 10% or something like that. So you can see just from that, we have a really different look to it. So within the options, we have a lot of different effects we can do. We can change the position, which is one of the major ones you're going to be doing, is changing the position. So we can change in Z space where that's at, and that will enhance the parallax. So for example, if we moved it to 200 and we moved it, based on how parallax works, the texture is going to come at us faster than the primary object. So you can kind of probably see what's happening there. And now if we move it back in Z space to like 1200, it's going to move at almost the same speed as the main object that we have isolated. So as a general rule of thumb, I would recommend to keep your textures between 0 to 1500 in Z space. And then below that, we have some brightness, some contrast. If you want to increase that, I have a way that you can change the color of this by the tint. So if you want it to be a different color, for example, you can invert the texture and then color it that way. So there's lots of different things you can do with the textures to really fine tune them. And I won't go through all the ones individually, but just recognize that they're kind of all unique in their own way. And then we have AE textures. Now these textures are not from images that are imported. These are actually created right from within After Effects. And there are advantages to using it this way. These ones tend to be a little bit sharper no matter the resolution. So we have all the same options. We have the opacity, brightness, scale, contrast. And you're just gonna have to play with all these different ones to see which one works best for your double exposure. Let's go over the controller one now. I'll turn back up the metal 1 opacity to something like 50, where it's a little bit more extreme. I'll turn the invert off. That might be too extreme, maybe like 25. Okay, so we can definitely see that there's texture happening on there. Now if we go to the matte controller, we have a bunch of different options in here. And how the matte controller works is I first have a master matte, and then I have an individual matte for all the different elements that you can add to your scene. So the master one, if we turn on the opacity and put up to like 50, we can see that there's a vignette happening now. There's actually a matte layer that I have within here, and I'll turn all the way up to 100%. And now we can't see any of the texture in the very center. So you can isolate the different textures and elements, the overlay elements within here, but you can make them so that they're not visible over your object, which really helps for isolating. And you can make this as subtle as you want. And the other cool thing, how I have it set up, you can move the position of it. So let's say, for example, you want it to be moved over. So really quickly, you can turn that off, and this would work for all of them. So the master one works for all the different effects, or you can go in individually. So let's say, for example, you have an AE texture that you want over the whole thing, but you have a static texture that you want to have it have a matte so that you can't see it over the object. So you could go in to the matte controller and go to the static matte opacity and turn that up to 50. And now it looks the same, but if we had other textures on and other effects, you would see that it's only matting just the static textures. So it's really cool to be able to fine tune exactly how you want the textures to be overlaid and look within your scene. All right, so moving on, we have dust, and we have two types of dust. We have regular speed dust and slow-mo dust, and nothing really crazy here. You can change the color though, which is really convenient. So if you have like, instead of, this is a darker scene, if you had a light scene, you could change the dust to a darker color. You can adjust the feather of the dust so it's not so sharp. Next, we have the bokeh. So this has a few more options. If we enable this, so you can see them immediately. And the first thing you're going to do, just like most of the other ones, is turn the opacity down to something like 20. But the cool thing about this is you can change the glow intensity and the color of the bokeh. So there's a lot of options you can play with in that. There's the fire. I created the fire in Cinema 4D with a plugin called Turbulence FD. If anybody's curious, it's a really cool kind of deep plugin. But so this way you have some really cool fire to add to your scene if you want. So you'll notice that the first couple ones, Fire 1, Fire 2, and Fire 3, don't come on instantly. That's because the fire is building up. But if we go to slow-mo fire, those are instantly on. So feel free to play with that, edit the tint, the position, whatever, everything is editable just like all the other effects. And the sparks are the exact same as the dust, except for they're sparks. So we have, I'll turn the fire off. So there's two different types of sparks. This first one is just like a spark hit. It just kind of hits and then the sparks go away. The slow-mo sparks stay on the whole time and just kind of slowly rise up. And then finally, we have a spot color. Now, if we enable this, you'll see right away that we have like kind of a light or a brightness happening in the center. Now, the power of this is in being able to shift the focus to a different area, either through color or through brightness. So you can take the color of this and adjust it to whatever color you want. So let's say you wanted a touch of color in this scene. You could do it that way. You can move the position of it. Now, the position movement is really cool because you can actually move it to like 500, and you can see if I undo and redo that this is moving in 3D, this actual color spot that I have set up. So you can have it be in the foreground or the background behind your double exposure, however you want. And same goes for any of the textures or any of the overlay elements. You can have them all either be in front or behind of the isolated element. So I'll undo that. Now you can also adjust the brightness of this to turn it down, make it a lot more subtle. You can adjust the scale, you can adjust the feathering, or you can adjust the spot color amount. So it's basically the amount of color in that spot color. So we can turn that down and then it's more of like a white color, or we can turn it up and it's more saturated. And I did use it in quite a few of the different parts. Like for example, in this beach scene that I did add the spot color in here just to enhance the sun. So you can use it as like a color enhancer as well. There's a lot of different uses for it. And again, feel free to jump into my demo file and look at how I did everything. All right, so there's one more piece of advice I want to give, and that is that sometimes After Effects, the cache gets a little bit hung up for some reason in this project. All you have to do is go to Edit, Purge, All Memory, and Disk Cache. And then it'll say, are you sure you want to delete all those files? And you'll be like, I sure do. And then delete them. And then typically that solves the problem. And I'm not saying that you will all have problems like that. I just noticed that once in a while that would happen to me. And once I cleared the memory and disk cache, that it instantly went away. What if you want your double exposure to be longer than 5 seconds? Because the way that I have the project set up, the final result is 150 frames or 5 seconds. Well, I have it easily able to go beyond 5 seconds to 10 seconds. And then beyond 10 seconds, I have a method to show you that will help you speed that up to get it as long as you want it to be. So let's go over how to extend it to 10 seconds. What you're going to want to do is go to the module that you're working with, and you can see that it's 150 frames for the whole duration. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Command K on a Mac or Control K on a PC. And I'm going to go down to the duration, and I'm going to change that to 300. So now you can see that we have the duration 300, but now we have to go into the Add Effects composition and do the same thing within there. 300. And then I'm going to zoom out. I'm going to hold on a Mac Option and on a PC Alt, and then scroll my wheel back, and that'll zoom out. You can also adjust this on the bottom to scroll back to see more of the timeline. And then I have to go back into one more comp, the parallax editor. And we're going to do the exact same thing in that one to 300. And I'm going to zoom back out of that one. Now you just have to grab all of the layers, Command A, and drag them all to the end. And then we're going to go back to the effects panel that we were just in and grab all of those and drag them over, and to the module and drag that over. And that's the quick way to extend it to 10 seconds. Now, this way works really fast because you only really have to edit those 3 compositions. All the ones before that, like for example, the double exposure editor, those are set up at 10 seconds. And I knew that a lot of users would want it more than 5 seconds. So I added this in here that all the other compositions except for those 3 were 10 seconds. So let's say, for example, you want it to be longer than that. There's really no way of getting around the fact that you're going to have to go into every single composition and do the Command K or extend it. But I do have a way that makes it a little bit faster for you. There's a download that you can get off of AEScripts called RD Comp Setter. So just Google RD Comp Setter and you'll come to the AEScripts site, and it's a free script. And I'm going to show you how it works. I'll bring it up under Window, RD Comp Setter. And the cool thing about this is you can select the comps and you can change the duration of a comp without having to go in and hit Command K for every single one. And you can do a bunch of other really cool things too. You can adjust the size of the composition, you can adjust the frame rate, you can do all kinds of different things, but I end up using it mostly for the duration option in this. So what you'd want to do then is select all the different compositions within the module that you're working with, and then all the different miscellaneous comps as well, so that we have every single one, and also the textures. So I know there gets to be a lot of different layers, and I'm holding Command on a Mac or Option on a PC so that it continues to select all the different ones. So you get the point that we're going to select all the different comps associated with that module, and then the module 1 as well. And then we're going to change the duration to whatever we want. So if we wanted it 30 seconds, we would have 900 frames. So we change that to 900, and then we would, I'm going to bring this down just a little bit more. The cool thing is it has the option on the bottom to update nested comps, but the problem is I found it only goes one level deep. If you have a composition with only one nested composition in it, it works great. But beyond that, you have to select them like we just did. And then we just hit apply, and then you'll just have to go into each one of the compositions, grab all the different layers, and drag them to the end of the duration that you have. All right, so that's how you would extend the time beyond 5 seconds into 10 seconds or beyond 10 seconds. How to add video as the overlay double exposed element rather than a still image. So how we're going to do that is I'm going to import Command I, and I'm going to bring in this time-lapse video footage of these clouds. So I'll hit open, and that'll bring it into there. And now what we're going to do, I'm working in the main project file in the example module. So I'll go into that, and I'm going to twirl down the module steps, and I'm going to go to Insert Source, Secondary Source, and I'm going to change this and insert the footage into this layer. So I'll put that on top of there, and I'm going to scale it up by hitting S and bringing that to the same size as the original one was. I'll delete the original photo in there. And then what we have to do is go back into the project panel and twirl that up, and we're going to go into step 2, isolate elements. And we're going to double click on the secondary isolation. Now what you have to do in here is hit Command K, and that brings up the composition settings in a PC. It's Control K, or you can go to composition settings. And then what we're going to do is change the duration 300. And then I'm going to hold Option and zoom out so that we're revealing the whole timeline. And I'm going to drag that over so that it's all the way across. And we can see that everything's working perfect. But in the hierarchy, if we go up one composition higher, you'll see that in the secondary freeze frame, we still don't have any motion going on. And that's because there's a time remap set on this layer. So what we have to do is just, if you're not seeing that, just highlight the layer and hit UU really fast, and it'll bring up any keyframed settings with that layer. And then we're just going to delete that keyframe, and then that will delete the freeze frame that was happening on that. All right, and I just want to explain really quick why I had it set up this way. If we go back into the secondary isolation, this would be the composition where you would isolate it via the pen tool or whatever, but the one that kind of trips it up is the rotobrush tool. And I had this specifically set at 1 frame because I wanted you to just roto out the 1 frame. And the rotobrush tool is actually meant to rotoscope multiple frames. And that's not how I wanted it used in this project. And just from what you saw from the rotobrush tutorial, it kind of gets really deep really fast. And that's just for editing 1 frame, let alone editing multiple frames together. So I tried to set this up as user-friendly as possible, and in doing so, keeping this as only 1 frame. So then once you go back to here, it would just freeze frame that 1 frame that we isolated and brought it throughout the whole project. So now what we've done then is we've extended this out, and then we went into the freeze frame and we have deleted that freeze frame, that time remap on there. All right, and that is everything. Now if we go back to our module example, you can see that everything's working perfectly. We'll have our clouds animating in there. And you'll notice that you can see the edges on here, so you're going to want to go into the double exposure editor and adjust the positioning of where it's at in the scale and whatever else to make it look correct. But that's the basic workflow. To go into the isolation frame, to extend the duration of this to the length of your video, or 300, that's 10 seconds, and then go into the secondary freeze frame, and then delete that secondary isolation time remap by hitting UU and just deleting that keyframe. And again, this only works for the secondary source. It's not supported to use this method for the primary source being isolated because of the fact that it gets a little bit too involved with isolating moving elements. All right, thanks again, you guys. Have a great day.